Mark lived a normal life, working at a standard office job where he easily got along with everyone. He also had his two best friends, Desmond and Stella, whom he grew up with. Despite working directly under his boss, Dylan, Mark had never spoken to him. In fact, no one except Dylan's secretary was allowed to communicate with him directly. All interactions between Dylan and the employees were mediated through the secretary. It was Mark's birthday, and he went to the club with Stella and Desmond to celebrate. They drank and danced until they couldn't anymore. As they were leaving, all three were so drunk they didn't know where they were going. Mark suddenly bumped into a random man and hugged him. The man turned out to be Dylan. Dylan recognized Mark and tried to shake him awake, but Mark was too drunk and hugged Dylan even tighter. Desmond and Stella tried to pull him off, but he wouldn't budge. At last, Dylan offered to drive Mark home. Stella and Desmond left, and Dylan took Mark to his car. He then realized he forgot to ask where Mark lived. He tried asking Mark, but he kept talking gibberish. In the end, Dylan decided to take Mark to his own house. When they got to Dylan's place, he carried Mark to his room. He turned away for just a moment, and when he looked back, Mark had taken off his shirt and was about to remove his jeans. Dylan quickly stopped him. Mark glanced at Dylan's hand, stopping him, then looked at Dylan's face and said in a slurred voice, "I feel hot," before kissing him. Dylan kissed back, lost in the moment, but then pulled away, realizing what was happening. In a hoarse voice, he asked, "Do you know who I am?" Mark, still drunk, replied, "Dylan, my boss." Dylan then asked, "And do you know what we are doing?" Mark nodded, wrapped his arms around Dylan's neck, pulled him onto the bed with Dylan on top of him and kissed him again. Dylan hesitated, but then gave in, and they shared an intense, passionate night. The next morning, Mark woke up in an unfamiliar room. He was unfazed, as this wasn't the first time he'd ended up at a stranger's place after a night of drinking. He got up and looked around for the man he had followed home, but it seemed he was alone in the enormous house, which looked like a museum. He ate a toast which he saw on a dining table and left. Part of him was curious about who he had spent the night with, but another part preferred not to know. He immediately went to find his two friends to ask if they saw the man he left with, and to scold them for leaving him with a stranger again. Mark was at work when Dylan summoned him to his office. Mark was shocked and kept thinking of what he had possibly done for him to be called to Dylan's office. No employee had ever been called to Dylan's office, so if he had been called, then he must have done something big. With his mind racing and his hands trembling, he knocked and entered. He expected Dylan to lash out at him or something, but Dylan just stared at him as if waiting for him to speak. Breaking the silence, Mark asked why he had been called. Dylan's expression fell, and he mumbled, "You really don't remember." He then explained that his secretary was resigning and asked if Mark could temporarily fill the position until a new one was hired. Mark was about to decline, but Dylan mentioned that the offer came with triple his current salary. Mark said he would think about it, and Dylan told him to take his time. As Mark left Dylan's office, he realized Dylan wasn't as bad as he had thought. In fact, he seemed quite sweet. Just then he noticed all his colleagues' eyes on him. They asked him if he was scolded by the boss, but Mark told them that wasn't as mean as they all thought. Mark had already decided to accept the secretary job the moment he heard about the tripled salary. He didn't want to appear eager, so he claimed he needed to think about it. The next day at work, when Mark saw Dylan's secretary packing up, he quickly went to Dylan to accept the job offer before it passed him by. Mark noticed a smile on Dylan's face when he told him about accepting the job. The resigned secretary handed over Dylan's schedule and briefed Mark on his new responsibilities. Mark asked her if there was anything or behavior Dylan hated so he would be careful. She told him not to worry and that Dylan was a nice person. Mark started his work as the new secretary. He now became the new mediator between the employees and the boss. The job wasn't as easy as he had thought. He barely had a chance to rest, unlike his previous job where he mostly sat behind a computer and only got up for the restroom or meals. Despite that, he still enjoyed it with the thought of his salary being tripled. Dylan never pressured him about anything and never scolded him, even though Mark made plenty of mistakes each day. One day, Mark could no longer hold back his thoughts and asked Dylan why he never personally communicated with his employees. Dylan replied, I don't really know how to communicate with people. Mark then asked, Are you an introvert? Dylan responded, You could say that. Mark suggested, But at least you should give your employees a chance to know you, and you should know them. Dylan asked, What do you suggest I do? I don't think I can suddenly start communicating with them. I don't want them to feel awkward around me. Mark thought for a while and then suggested an outing trip. That will give everyone the chance to know each other and have fun. Dylan thought it was a good idea, even though the thought of being around everyone and talking to them made him nervous. He entrusted Mark with planning the trip. On the day of the trip, Desmond and Stella insisted on joining Mark, even though they didn't work with him. It had been a long time since they had gone on a trip together, so they wanted to take advantage of this opportunity, especially since they wouldn't have to pay for anything. Dylan didn't mind them joining and personally picked them up in his car since the hired bus was full. Stella and Desmond exchanged glances when they saw Dylan, and said to Mark that he looked familiar. Mark ignored them because those two always thought someone looked familiar. During the trip, Mark made sure Dylan actively engaged in every activity and even gave speeches. At first, the employees felt uncomfortable, but they soon loosened up as they realized Dylan wasn't as bad as they had thought. They were even surprised to learn that Dylan knew all of their names. That night, rooms were shared, and Dylan and Mark ended up in the same room. The next day, they all returned from the trip. Dylan drove the three friends back to their homes. As soon as Dylan dropped them off and left, Stella suddenly remembered. I remember him now, the guy from the club. Mark asked what she was talking about, and Desmond chimed in, Oh, yes, the man who offered to take Mark home. They then explained how Dylan was the person Mark had followed home on the night of his birthday when he got drunk. Mark exclaimed in shock, He couldn't believe it. He tried to remember, but couldn't. How had Dylan acted like nothing had happened between them all this time? Was that the reason why Dylan gave him the secretary position? A lot of questions and scenarios raced through Mark's mind. At work, Mark sat silently, trying to remember what happened that night. Suddenly, everything came rushing back to him. He shot up, screaming in shock and startling everyone. Even Dylan rushed out of his office to ask what was wrong. Mark ignored him and rushed to the washroom to splash water on his face. When he went back to his seat, he began typing a resignation letter. He couldn't face Dylan anymore. By the end of the day, he had printed it out and presented it to Dylan. Dylan looked at the letter and asked, What is this? Mark replied, A resignation letter. Dylan asked, concerned, Why, so sudden? Did I do something wrong? Mark replied, Well, not really. I just don't think I can work around you anymore. Dylan eagerly asked, Can you please tell me the reason why? Mark took a deep breath and then asked, Why didn't you tell me that we did that? Dylan replied, You remember now? Mark asked again, Why did you act like nothing happened between us? Dylan answered, I thought you would remember, but you didn't, and I didn't know how to tell you. Is that why you want to resign? Mark replied, Well, I don't know, Dylan cut in, You can take a break from work if you want. You don't have to resign, or you can quit being my secretary and go back to your normal job if I make you uncomfortable. Mark took back his resignation letter and said, Never mind. I think I'm overreacting. It's not like you're the first person I've ever followed home while drunk. I'm just a bit shocked and embarrassed because you're my boss. Dylan asked, with a hint of hurt and jealousy in his voice, Does it happen often? Mark replied, Just a couple of times. Let's just forget everything and act like nothing happened. Dylan then blurted out, I don't want to. Honestly, I've liked you for a while now. It started with watching and envying how confident and lively you are and how you easily get along with people. But slowly, I found myself falling for you. I wouldn't have done it that night if it was someone else. Mark stood there, shocked, and not knowing what to say. He couldn't believe his boss, whom he had never even spoken to personally before, liked him. He replied, I have never thought of you in that way. I mean, you are my boss. Dylan took Mark's hand and said, Can you stop seeing me as your boss then, and just see me as an ordinary guy who likes you? Mark was taken aback by everything and didn't know how to respond. He withdrew his hand and bolted out of the office. In the following days, Mark acted as if Dylan hadn't confessed his love for him, and Dylan never brought it up, not wanting to make Mark any more uncomfortable. They only talked about work and nothing else. One day, Mark came to work to find that Dylan wasn't there. Some colleagues needed Dylan to sign important documents that day, so Mark had to take them to Dylan's house. When he got there, he rang the bell several times, but no one answered. He was about to leave when Dylan opened the door, looking pale and weak. Dylan invited him in, and Mark kept glancing at him worriedly. "Are you okay?" Mark asked. Dylan replied that he was fine. Mark put his hand on Dylan's forehead to check his temperature and exclaimed, "You're burning up. Don't you think you should go to the hospital?" Dylan replied that he was fine and that this happened occasionally when he was stressed. He explained that he had some prescribed medications and would be fine after taking them and getting some rest. Mark still wasn't convinced and kept touching Dylan's face, asking, "Are you sure?" Dylan held Mark's hand on his face and said with a weak voice, "I am very sensitive to touch whenever I am sick." Mark slowly withdrew his hand and changed the topic, offering to help Dylan to his room. He made Dylan lie in bed and helped him take his medicine. Mark put the pill in his hand, giving it to Dylan. Instead of taking it with his hand, Dylan took it from Mark's hand with his mouth. Mark was stunned, but acted normal and helped Dylan drink some water. Mark asked Dylan to close his eyes and take a nap, but Dylan shook his head, saying, "I'm scared you'll leave once I close my eyes." Mark asked, "Shouldn't I leave?" Dylan replied, "I want to see you when I wake up." Mark stared at Dylan for a while before saying, "Okay, I won't leave. You can sleep now." Dylan smiled weakly, and as the effect of the medicine kicked in, he quickly drifted off to sleep. Mark took out his laptop and sat by a desk next to Dylan's bed to reply to some emails. After he was done, he glanced at sleeping Dylan and went to squat beside him. He stared at Dylan's face and was about to touch it when Dylan suddenly turned, his face falling just an inch away from Mark's. Mark felt his heart skip a beat, and immediately got up to leave the room. He didn't know if he was just startled or if he felt something for Dylan. A few hours later, Dylan woke up. He immediately scanned the room, but Mark was not there. He sighed sadly, but just then Mark entered with a bowl of porridge. Dylan's face lit up as he saw Mark and said, "I thought you left." Mark replied, "I just went to prepare something for you since I thought you might wake up hungry." Mark put a bed table on the bed in front of Dylan and placed the porridge on it. Mark asked Dylan to taste it and tell him how it tasted because it was his first time cooking anything. Dylan ate it so deliciously, and Mark asked, "Is it that good?" Dylan smiled and said, "No, it tastes horrible," and continued eating. Mark took the spoon from Dylan and tasted the porridge. He almost threw up and struggled to swallow. He tried to stop Dylan from continuing to eat it, but Dylan didn't stop. "Why are you still eating it? Even I can't," Mark asked. "Because you made it," Dylan replied. Mark felt a flip in his stomach and went silent. After Dylan finished eating, Mark wanted to check if he was still burning hot, so he was about to touch his forehead, but stopped midway when he remembered Dylan saying he was sensitive to touch. Dylan noticed and took his hand, guiding it to his forehead. Dylan's temperature was back to normal, and Mark breathed a sigh of relief. Mark asked if Dylan would be okay on his own because he had to send the documents back to work. Dylan didn't want Mark to leave, but he couldn't keep him there forever, so he said he was okay. He signed the documents, and Mark left. On the weekend, Mark and his two best friends went to the club again for their regular weekend outing. When it was time to order drinks, Mark asked for juice instead of his usual strong alcoholic drinks. Stella and Desmond stared at him in shock, asking, "Who are you?" Mark didn't know why he didn't want any alcohol either. Usually, he would drink until he dropped. As he ordered juice, he thought of Dylan. He didn't want to get drunk and end up in another man's bed again. It felt like it would be cheating on Dylan, even though they weren't dating and he wasn't even sure how he felt about Dylan. Even when Stella showed him a hot guy, because Mark usually flirted with guys he thought were attractive at club, he didn't even glance and said he wasn't interested. Stella and Desmond were even more shocked. It was one thing for Mark to reject alcohol, but to pass up a hot guy at the club? They asked if he was really the Mark they knew, but Mark's head was occupied with thoughts of Dylan. At work, Mark couldn't stop glancing at Dylan every second. He even felt jealous when he saw Dylan smiling and communicating with the employees, even though he had encouraged Dylan to do so. On another weekend, instead of going out with his friends, Mark went to Dylan's house. Dylan was surprised when he opened the door to see Mark. "Did you bring documents for me to sign again?" Dylan asked. "I just came to check up on you. Since you live alone, no one would know if anything happens to you," Mark replied. Dylan asked, "As what, huh?" Mark responded, confused. Dylan continued, "Are you checking up on me as my secretary, or a friend, or something else?" Mark hesitated, replying, since we are not at work then, friend?" Dylan mumbled to himself, "At least we are getting somewhere," before asking Mark if he could offer him anything since he was visiting as a friend. Dylan offered wine, but Mark immediately replied that he had quit anything alcoholic. Dylan asked, "Really? Why?" "I don't know," Mark replied, even though he knew the reason. Dylan didn't ask further and just brought out juice. They both sat there awkwardly, not knowing what to talk about or do. They mostly talked about work, so now that there was no work, they felt like strangers. Dylan suggested playing a game of rock, paper, scissors where the winner gets to ask the loser a question about themselves. Mark agreed, and they started. Mark won the first round, but had no question in mind, so he just asked, "Do you prefer tea or coffee?" Dylan answered, "Tea." The next round Dylan won, and he asked Mark, "Do you like to be hit on, or do you hit on them?" Mark thought for a while then answered, "It depends on how much I like the person. I'm timid when it comes to hitting on someone I really like, so I'd prefer to be hit on." Dylan slowly nodded his head as if taking note. The next round Dylan won again, and he asked, "What's your love language?" Mark replied, "Every love language there is." The next round Mark won, and he asked Dylan, "What is your favorite color?" Dylan chuckled and asked, "What's my favorite color? Why are you asking basic questions?" Mark replied, "I don't really have other questions in mind, and it's not basic. It's also an important thing to know." Dylan then replied, "Okay, brown is my favorite color." Mark replied, "I've never met anyone whose favorite color is brown." Dylan then said, "Well, congratulations, you just met me," and they both laughed. They continued playing for a long time, until they were tired and had learned almost everything about each other. At the end of the day, they had grown closer and more comfortable with each other. Mark had figured out his feelings for Dylan, but didn't know how to go about it. He had been in relationships before, but they were never serious. He had never been in a committed relationship and had never felt such strong feelings for anyone as he did for Dylan. One day at work, Dylan needed some documents from when the company first started, so he went to the small, old storage room to get them. Mark wanted to get them instead since it was his job, but Dylan insisted on getting them himself, since he might find them faster. When he got there, he was surprised to find heavy boxes and other stuff scattered all over the place. There was hardly any space to step. He tried to go back, since it looked like it would take ages to find what he was looking for. As he tried to leave, he realized the door had locked by itself on the outside, and he couldn't get out. He kept knocking, but there was no one passing by at that moment, so he was stuck. Meanwhile, Mark noticed that Dylan had been gone for a while and decided to check on him. As he opened the door, he found Dylan right there. Mark squeezed himself inside, asking if Dylan needed help while closing the door behind him. Dylan barely managed to ask him to leave it open before the door clicked shut. When he tried to open it again, he realized it was locked, as expected. Suddenly, Dylan noticed a box on the top shelf right above Mark, about to fall on him. He quickly grabbed Mark by the waist and pulled him in close to him. The box crashed to the floor, but the two of them were now distracted by each other's face that was now mere inches apart. Dylan asked, "Why aren't you breathing?" And Mark realized he had been holding his breath. Mark slowly let out his breath, feeling Dylan's grip still firm around his waist. There was literally no space between the two. Mark suggested moving some boxes to make room. Dylan replied in a low voice, "Why don't we just stay like this?" Mark's heart raced as he tried avoiding Dylan's gaze. Then Dylan said, "You have pretty lips." Mark mumbled, "Thank you," and Dylan chuckled. Mark asked, "What's funny?" And Dylan replied, "Nothing. I'm just trying to distract myself from kissing you." Mark stared at Dylan's lips and slowly leaned in. Dylan, caught in the moment, moved closer too. Their lips met in a soft, gentle kiss, both making little kiss noises. For the first time, Mark felt love through a kiss. As they kissed, an employee passing by heard the kissing sounds and mistook it for rats. She quickly went to inform her colleagues about rats in the storage room. Concerned that the rats might damage important documents, the employees grabbed sticks and whatever they could find and rushed to the storage room. When they flung open the door, they were met with the sight of Dylan and Mark kissing. Startled, Dylan and Mark pulled away from the kiss, but couldn't separate due to the confined space. The employees, now smiling and apologizing profusely, slowly closed the door, encouraging them to continue. Dylan asked them to leave the door open, and they quickly retreated to their workstations. Mark, embarrassed, sighed and asked, "Is it possible to resign now?" Dylan just smiled, took his hand, and led him out. As they reached the midst of people, Mark withdrew his hand. By the time they emerged, news of their kiss had already spread throughout the company. They heard whispers and giggles, and saw eyes trying not to be too obvious as they walked by. Mark followed Dylan to his office because it was quiet there and he wasn't ready to answer any questions from his colleagues. He stayed there, pretending to be busy and avoiding eye contact with Dylan, until the workday ended and everyone had left. When the coast was clear, Mark packed his things and headed for the door, but Dylan blocked his way. "My feelings are still the same," Dylan said. "Huh?" Mark asked, confused. "I never spoke about my feelings for you again after that day," Dylan continued, "so maybe you might think I don't like you anymore." Mark mumbled, "I never thought that." Dylan then asked, "Would you come to my house again this weekend, to check up on me?" "Should I?" Mark asked. "I would be happy if you did, but if you'll be busy, that's okay," Dylan replied. Mark said, "I won't be busy," and Dylan asked, "Then see you this weekend?" Mark nodded and left with his cheeks red. On the weekend, Mark headed to Dylan's house. On the way, he spotted a couple's necklace in a shop's display and without much thought, went in and bought it. When he arrived at Dylan's house and rang the bell, Dylan immediately opened the door as if he had been waiting there. They exchanged shy highs as Mark stepped inside. Mark pulled out the necklace he had bought and handed it to Dylan. Dylan looked at the box with a smile forming on his lips, and asked, "What's this?" Mark gestured with his head for Dylan to open it. When Dylan saw the couple's necklaces inside, he asked with a shy smile, "Is this a couple's necklace?" Mark blurted out, "Let's date." Dylan, stunned, asked, "What did you say?" "Let's date," Mark repeated. "Does that mean you don't really like me?" Dylan asked. "Because you said you prefer to be hit on when you really like the person." "No, I really like you, a lot. I never thought I could like someone this much." "I'm not hitting on you. I'm asking you to date me," Mark quickly replied. "It's the same thing," Dylan said. Mark then replied, "Okay, I take it back. Let's not date." Dylan smiled and hugged Mark, saying, "I was just teasing. You ruined my surprise though." Mark asked, "What surprise?" Dylan took his hand and led him to the dining area. There was a cake on the table with the words, "Will you be my boyfriend?" written on it, and a written card beside it. Mark picked up the card and read Dylan's heartfelt message, conveying his feelings for him. Holding back tears, Mark looked at Dylan, who then brought out a box and handed it to him. Inside were matching couple bracelets. "I was going to give this to you if I got lucky and you accepted to be my boyfriend," Dylan said. Mark asked Dylan to turn around, and when Dylan asked why, Mark replied, "I want to cry." Dylan smiled, hugged Mark, and said, "You don't have to feel embarrassed crying in front of me." After Mark finished crying, he extended his arm for Dylan to help him put on the bracelet. Once it was on, Mark helped Dylan put on his. They then assisted each other with the necklaces. Mark used his finger to write a bold yes on the cake, licking the frosting off his finger. He then asked, "Did you make the cake yourself?" Dylan nodded, and Mark said, "It tastes horrible, but I like it because you made it." Dylan chuckled and asked, "Does it really taste horrible?" Mark replied, "You can taste it." Dylan said, "Okay," then pulled Mark in close and kissed him. Afterward, he said, "I guess your lips made it sweet. It didn't taste horrible to me at all." Mark stared at Dylan with a disgusted face and said, "Bye," pretending to leave. Dylan pulled him back and kissed him again. Pulling away from the kiss, Mark asked, "Why are you always pulling me?" With a smirk, Dylan replied, "You can pull me too if you want." Mark then pulled Dylan closer by the waist, his eyes locked on Dylan's face. "Are you happy now?" Dylan asked. Mark replied, "Shut up," and kissed him, with Dylan kissing back. Between kisses, Mark whispered, "I love you." Dylan paused, stunned, then replied, "I love you too," and the kissing continued. Dylan and Mark didn't officially announce their relationship at work, but they made it obvious they were dating. Mark didn't even need to inform Stella and Desmond. They flaunted their relationship everywhere and every time, not giving anyone a break. Dylan didn't have to find another secretary because he had found one for a lifetime.